we now have direct, unfiltered access into what the Nazis thought of the Latter-day Saints.
Were Nazis actually interested in occultism?
Fundamentally, that was a survival strategy. It was not because of ideological alignment.
Did Hitler or Nazi Germany find the Latter-day Saints dangerous in any way? Certain ideas?
Well, once we have won the war and once we've solved the Jewish question, you Mormons are next.
Could this have influenced Latter-day Saints to join the Nazi Party, or not really? What are your thoughts there?
Latter-day Saint teachings do not align with National Socialism, and the Nazis themselves recognized as much.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Sword and Spirit. My name is Daniel Sorensen, your host, and today I'm joined with a friend of mine who I'm really excited to talk about some of the work that he's done. But today we're joined by Stephen Smoot. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Well, we're glad to have you, and it's going to be, like I said, I'm really excited for today's conversation. But just before we get started into today's discussion, I just want you to quickly, Stephen, just introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, your background, your upbringing in the church, just before we jump into today's discussion.
So I'm currently an adjunct instructor in ancient scripture at BYU, and I am a research associate with the Ancient America Foundation. I co-host a podcast with Neil and Jasmine Rapley called Informed Saints, which I hope some of your viewers have perhaps caught an episode or two. We seem to cover a lot of the similar issues here on Sword in the Spirit and Informed Saints. In terms of my background, my academic training is actually not in the topic we're going to be discussing today necessarily. It's in Semitic and Egyptian languages and literature. I'm a PhD candidate at the Catholic University of America in Semitic languages and Egyptology and biblical studies. Before that, I did a master's degree in the same topic of Near and Middle Eastern civilizations at the University of Toronto. And at BYU, my bachelor's degree was in Ancient Near Eastern Studies. I did, however, do a bachelor's degree in German studies from BYU, so perhaps I do have a little bit of relevant training for the topic at hand. But normally the waters I'm used to swimming in are ancient stuff, right? Old stuff, the BC stuff, not World War II or Nazi Germany. I can say a little bit about how I got into this topic, perhaps. In terms of my sort of background or life experience, I was born and raised in Utah in Salt Lake City. Served a mission for the church and then came back and went to BYU. So kind of your typical story there. I've lived most of my life in Utah, besides my mission and going out to do grad school and things like that. I've been a lifelong member of the church and multi-generational family in the church. You can probably guess from the name Smoot that I have some ancestors and relatives who are somewhat notable figures in church history. So I have some deep roots in Latter-day Saint history and culture out here in Utah. And in terms of my academic interest, besides all the ancient stuff I like to do, which is the Bible, Egyptology, Book of Mormon, Pearl of Great Price, that kind of stuff, I have a tremendous interest in church history, both early church history and contemporary church history, right? Or maybe I should say 20th century church history. I do have an interest in German topics by dint of my German studies degree at BYU, where I studied German and did a study abroad in Austria. Like any teenage boy, I became obsessed with World War II from watching, documentaries on the History Channel, and that kind of got me interested in the long term for studying World War II and, the Nazi period of German history and things like that. So I kind of swim in different pools in terms of what interests me intellectually, and hopefully I'm not becoming a master of none, right, an expert in all, or whatever, however that phrase goes. So yeah, that's sort of my background and some of my interests.
Awesome. Well, that's great. I think that's a great introduction, and I'm curious because for those of you watching today, we're going to be talking just about Germany, Mormonism in Germany, or specifically during around the time of World War II, specifically just Nazi Germany. But I'm curious, Stephen, before we just dive in, because you've done a lot of stuff in Egyptology, like it's a lot of stuff for I believe formerly for Scripture Central, and now for the Ancient America Foundation. What was there? Was this like a recent shift that you decided you're like, I want to just study specifically this area of the church? Was there like a shift? Tell me a little bit about that before we jump in.
So for a couple of years, I worked for Josh Coates at the B.H. Roberts Foundation. And if you've visited the Mormoner.org website, you'll see these Q&A articles on various topics related to church history or church doctrine or church culture, things like that. And Josh wanted to do an article on the history of the church in Nazi Germany. There have been a couple of publications over the years sort of talking about that history, and some people have questions like, hey, were the Nazis or were the Mormons were just a bunch of Nazis in Germany, or what was the deal, right? So Josh Coates had me investigate this. I was the only guy at the B.H. Roberts Foundation that spoke and read German, so he's like, okay, Smoot, this is your job now. So you got to go out of your normal wheelhouse and kind of swim in these new waters because you're the only guy here on staff that speaks German. So that's how I kind of got interested in this in terms of like a focused area of research and interest, right? Was just, I don't want to say necessarily by accident per se, but by virtue of just being kind of the right guy at the right place at the right time to be able to do this research. So that's why I sort of gravitated towards it, and eventually why I ended up doing this research that we're going to discuss. So you can thank Josh Coates, head of the B.H. Roberts Foundation, for kind of pushing me in that direction.
Fantastic. And we'll be sure to link Josh Coates' organization, Mormoner, and the B.H. Roberts Foundation. We'll be sure to link those into our description below. But like Stephen was talking about, as Stephen was talking about, we're just going to jump right in. So Stephen, tell us just a little bit about we're just going to dive right into your presentation. So I'm just going to give you the reins, and so the floor is yours. Perfect. I'll pop in here and there to ask some questions, but just go ahead and jump right in, and we'll just jump right into this discussion for today.
So here's a little thing I put together that hopefully might be of some interest, a PowerPoint to kind of guide us through our conversation. The Nazi secret police files on the Latter-day Saints. So in the Federal Archives in Berlin, Germany, there is a dossier compiled by the Sicherheitsdienst. That was the Nazi police intelligence agency, basically. And this dossier is on Die Mormonen, the Mormons. It spans from roughly 1933 to 1939 is when the documents are principally from. And it is, there's several different kinds of documents in this dossier. All of these documents, by the way, or most of them, have been unpublished until now. So pretty much no scholars until I was able to publish these documents were able to utilize this material. Some of it is duplicate material, duplicate content from other archives or other sources, but a lot of it is original. And it contains many different kinds of documents. It has police reports, photographs, letters, memoranda. It has photocopies of confiscated publications. And what's significant about these documents is that it provides insight into what the Nazis thought about the Latter-day Saints. It gives us unfiltered, sort of edited access into what the Nazis thought about the Mormons in Germany, what they thought about our doctrines, our teaching, our church. And it documents interactions and run-ins with the government that Latter-day Saints had. So you can understand, I hope, a little bit why this would be a significant historical resource, especially since most of these documents have not been published before. It contains roughly, 400 pages or so of material. Not all of it is necessarily earth-shattering or groundbreaking, but a number of them are. So what I'd like to do for our presentation is kind of go through some of the more noteworthy documents here. You can access all of these online on the B.H. Roberts Foundation website under the Mormon Gestapo Archive project, where there are both the full documents themselves, as well as translations of select documents, and a Q&A article on the topic of Latter-day Saints in Nazi Germany. If you are a subscriber to the journal Latter-day Saint Historical Studies, then you may have gotten a copy of this in the mail. It's their spring 2025 issue, came out a year ago, on the Latter-day Saints in Nazi Germany, where I discuss these documents and I present translations of them. So there's both an academic version and a popular online version that's freely accessible if you go to the B.H. Roberts Foundation website. So let's run through a little bit and see what do we have. What is the evidence we get from these documents? So we get surveillance and suspicion surrounding church members and missionaries in Germany at the time. This is a huge part of the documents that emerge out of this dossier, is police reports and other surveillance reports spying on church members in Nazi Germany. And it starts pretty early. It starts in 1933, right after Hitler comes to power. Now, a lot of these accounts we already knew about from other oral histories and published accounts and things like that, but that was mostly coming from Latter-day Saints describing their experience. Now we have the Nazis describing their side of the equation, as it were, right? So we now have it from both the Latter-day Saint and the Nazi point of view, this surveillance of church members in Germany at the time. And it gives us a more robust and well-rounded picture of what that looks like. We have reports on missionaries. So we have quite a number of missionaries in Germany at the time. We have, there's different missions. At one point, it's all one unified mission. Then they split the mission up and things like that, right? But, there's a sizable missionary presence in Germany. And we have the police following missionaries and reporting who they are, where they come from, their lodgings. So, for example, a lot of these reports are concerned the fact that Mormon missionaries are lodging with Jewish families or that they're living in Jewish-owned buildings. In fact, the church's mission headquarters in Berlin is owned in a building it's in a building owned by a Jew in Berlin. So that's concerning to the Gestapo, right? So we get those kinds of reports. As I mentioned, we have confiscated tracts and publications. So when they would arrest missionaries or spy on members in their meetings, they would sometimes confiscate these church publications and they would make photocopies. And much of the dossier actually is just this. It's photocopies of these confiscated tracts. And in a minute, we'll show you an important document that comes from this dossier on why they banned certain publications from the church, right? So confiscated tracts, publications. We have complaints from disgruntled ex-members and others who, they're claiming that the church is controlled by a Jewish millionaire in Utah, which is kind of funny, right? We have criticism coming from Nazis about church members, about their lack of enthusiasm for, Nazi ideals or Nazi policies, right? We have one document from a Nazi who's complaining that the Mormons he knows, they're not enthusiastic enough for the Jewish question, right? Meaning the stuff leading up to the Holocaust, which is really bad and nasty. So it's interesting to get those perspectives, those documents in here. We have letters from Nazi officials. So this guy here on your screen is named Justin Herre. He was a POW in Utah during World War I, and he came back to Germany and became an outspoken Nazi, and he became the mayor of Mildensee by Dessau, which is not too far from Berlin. And he writes letters, upset the fact that the Mormons in his town are seeming to undermine social cohesion and people's willingness to, follow Nazi ideology. So we get these kinds of letters of complaints from guys like this fellow here, Justin Herre. We have correspondence from the mission presidents. So Oliver Budge and Roy Welker, for example, they are two mission presidents in Germany who are writing letters to the Geheime Staatspolizei, the Gestapo, right? We've all heard of them. They're the bad guys from all the World War II movies that we watch. So the Gestapo, they're having correspondences from them, defending the church's position, defending its missionary efforts and things like that. So that gives us some really important insight into the kinds of interactions that church leaders, like mission leaders, are having with Nazi officials. And we have other memoranda within the dossier outlining serious ideological conflicts between Latter-day Saints and Nazi ideology and Nazi principles. For a minute later, we'll talk about this guy. Alfred Rosenberg is his name. And there's a memorandum written for him in 1938 where it outlines serious ideological discrepancies between what Latter-day Saints are teaching and Nazi ideology. And it goes so far as to discussions about banning the church in Germany and banning church activities. And so we get that sort of unfiltered access to what Nazis are thinking about, like in that regard there. So maybe, I don't know if there's anything you want to ask Daniel or any sort of questions we want to jump out here, but that kind of is a broad overview of some of the stuff that we have here in the files.
So one of the things that you talked about earlier on was specifically Latter-day Saints that were being spied on, okay, whether it be in keeping tabs on people would be through church meetings. So the first question that I have is: was there a specific reason for this? Did Hitler or Nazi Germany find the Latter-day Saints dangerous in any way? Certain ideas, beliefs they had dangerous? Was it because they were Judeo-Christian? Can you just talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, I can give a further discussion about that in a little bit here because I have some slides prepared for
Okay,
that.
cool.
But the short answer to your question is the Nazis perceived Latter-day Saints as both ideologically incompatible with National Socialism, and they found the Latter-day Saint presence in Nazi Germany as being potentially subversive. And they were keen to
Okay.
monitor Latter-day Saints with under suspicion that we're probably going to do something subversive. That was sort of the expectation, and they are looking for subversive activity among Latter-day Saints in Germany, precisely because Latter-day Saint belief and practice was seen as incompatible with Nazi ideals. And I'll share some examples of that here in just a minute. But to sort of answer your question, yeah, from the get-go, the church never really had a great reputation in Germany. But when the Nazis come into town, we super duper don't have a good reputation with them on ideological grounds. Let's rewind here a little bit and set the stage here, the historical stage. So in January 1933 is when Hitler becomes the Chancellor of Germany, right? And at that time, there are about 8,000 Latter-day Saints in Germany and Austria. By the time World War II breaks out in 1939, that number reaches about 13,000. The church is consistently identified as a Sekte in German, a sect literally, but it has both kind of the legal and pejorative connotations of like a cult. So, without getting too much in like the sort of complex legal stuff in Germany, basically some churches have like official recognized status, like the Catholic Church or the Lutheran Church. Other churches might have like sort of regional recognition in certain regional parts of Germany. And other churches are just a Sekte. They're kind of like, they don't enjoy the same kind of legal privileges and status like the Catholic Church does, for example. That's what the church is in Germany until after World War II, when they gain that kind of legal recognition. So what this means is that the Latter-day Saints in Germany are very much a minority. And they are more or less a suspicious and despised minority in Germany when Hitler comes to power in 1933. So here are your three options. If you are a religious minority in Germany and you don't have the kind of legal protections that the Catholics have or the evangelical Protestants have, here are kind of your three options. Option number one, you can go the route of Jehovah's Witnesses. So the Jehovah's Witnesses, as a policy, as an official policy and practice, they sort of officially resist Nazism. Okay, and the result of that is they go to concentration camps. So there's a specific category of concentration camp victims and inmates, and that's Jehovah's Witnesses, right? So that's option one. You can go the route of Jehovah's Witnesses, open resistance. Option two, you can do what Ludwig Müller did. He established what's called the Reichskirche, the Reichschurch. And you can officially align with the state. You can officially endorse the Nazi Party. You can openly promote Nazi ideals. You can openly endorse Hitler and Nazi beliefs over the pulpit, right? So that's going to ensure that you're safe with the regime and that you're on the regime's good side. But, the trade-off there is it's going to basically cost you your integrity and ultimately cost you your soul, right? So not great to be aligned with the Nazis, to kind of wed your version of Christianity with the Nazis. But if you want to, you can do that. Like this guy Ludwig Müller does. So what's the church's response? The church takes option three. And I call this sort of accommodation. That might not be exactly the right term, but it kind of closely approximates. The church never officially endorses the Nazi regime, but it also never officially resists it, okay? So what that means is you never get statements from church leaders in their official capacity as church leaders saying, we like the Nazis and we want our members to become Nazis and our church is compatible with the Nazis. On the flip side, you never get any church leaders openly calling for resistance against the Nazis. They instead try to find coexistence with the Nazis or accommodation. So you can call this an accommodationist approach if you would like. Article of Faith number 12 is really what sort of undergirds all of this, right? We believe in being subject to kings, presidents, rulers, and magistrates, and obeying, honoring, and sustaining the law. The 12th article of faith gets cited a lot by Latter-day Saints in Germany at this time when they are asked by the government, what is your official position sort of on the government, right? Both the Nazi government and like governments in general. They'll cite Article of Faith 12. And what they're doing there is they're saying, look, we're not going to openly resist you, but also, we can't bring ourselves to really openly endorse you. So the church is trying to kind of thread the needle in this kind of uncomfortable middle ground where they will accommodate Nazi rule, but they're not going to officially endorse the Nazis. That's the approach that the church takes. So if that's the church's approach, then what is the likelihood that if you're a Latter-day Saint in Germany, you're going to become a Nazi? It's actually pretty low. From the statistics we have, from what we can tell, only about 2.4% of Latter-day Saints actually become Nazi Party members, against the national average of about 10%. And Roger Meinert, who's the main researcher on this, he says there's no indication that any Latter-day Saints had any significant leadership position in the Nazi Party. And as a matter of fact, probably your typical Latter-day Saint in Germany is joining the Nazi Party sort of out of obligation because of their employment or something like that, right? And so there are cases of Latter-day Saints who are vocal Nazis, who support the Nazi regime, right? We can't pretend like that was never the case. But that's pretty atypical to get like vocally enthusiastic Latter-day Saints who are Nazis, right? Roger Meinert also points out the fact that instances of overt political statements by Nazi Party Latter-day Saints, like in church meetings, they're too infrequent to suggest a pattern, right? In other words, Latter-day Saints are not like a hotbed for Nazi ideology and promoting Nazi ideology, right? So World War II breaks out in 1939. And when it breaks out, leadership of the branches in Germany goes to local leadership, okay? So Americans, both the missionaries and then the mission leaders, they will leave Germany at the outbreak of the war, and the German saints are sort of left to their own devices. So they take over local leadership, and you will get Latter-day Saints who will fight in all the branches of the German military. They fight in the army, they fight in the Air Force. We do have a few Latter-day Saints who become members of the SS. So for those who don't know, the SS is the paramilitary organization of the Nazi Party that is established initially to be like kind of Hitler's bodyguards, but then it evolves into its own kind of branch of the military, essentially. And you do get some Latter-day Saints who join the SS, but not many. And in fact, one of them who joins the SS, he later becomes a defector because he becomes disillusioned with, Germany's war efforts. So it's kind of a complicated legacy there. But you do have a few Latter-day Saints who become SS members, but not many. During World War II, about 1,000 Latter-day Saints lose their lives due to war-related causes. So they either die on the front lines or they die in the bombing raids over the cities or things like that, right? And many thousand more become displaced because of the war. They have to flee their homes get destroyed, etc., right? So that's your experience during the war. So maybe if we want to, we can kind of go through this a little bit more in depth, some of these examples I posted before, but I want to make sure, Daniel, if you have any thoughts or questions before we proceed further, perhaps.
Yeah, I just have one question. Because one of the things that you mentioned, you said
Sure.
it was atypical for Latter-day Saints to be members of the Nazi Party. But one of the things I want to share real quick is this image of Heber J. Grant meeting with Nazi leaders. So you you mentioned it was atypical for Latter-day Saints to be members of the Nazi Party. However, in this picture, we see Heber J. Grant meeting with it looks like other Nazi leaders and a swastika flag in the background. Does this? Yeah. So my question would be, for people that are unfamiliar with this image, does this kind of could this have influenced Latter-day Saints to join the Nazi Party, or not really? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I can tell you everything about this photograph. In fact, I had it prepared for my slides, so we'll just address it now.
Okay, cool.
And then we can see it later. But yeah, I'm actually glad you're asking this question because I think it's deeply unfair and even dishonest the way that this picture is typically shared on the internet. Heber J. Grant, the Mormon prophet, in front of the Nazi flag, right? So who are those people with him? First of all, what's the setting? Let's address that. It's 1937. It's July 1937. That photograph is taken in Frankfurt, Germany. Heber J. Grant speaks in both Berlin and Frankfurt to assemblies of Latter-day Saints and others who have assembled to hear him talk. So there's both Latter-day Saints and non-Latter-day Saints in the audience. they are speaking in rented halls. Those were not church buildings. In fact, I don't think they had any church buildings until after the war, or they had very few. They're typically meeting in rented spaces. That particular photograph in Frankfurt was taken in the National Socialist Teachers League building in Frankfurt. In other words, it was a Nazi-owned building they were meeting in order to accommodate the size of the crowd, which reached up to 1,000 people. Of course, it is going to come equipped with what was then the national flag of Germany at the time. By law, that was the national flag of Germany, was the Hakenkreuzflagge, the swastika flag, right? Heber J. Grant has no say on what national flag gets flown over his head when he is speaking at a rented space owned by the Nazi Party. So let's just make that very clear. And in fact, a few weeks earlier, Heber J. Grant is in Switzerland, and he's speaking to saints in Switzerland, and there are pictures of him speaking in front of the Swiss flag, the national flag of Switzerland, okay? It's no different than when the President of the United States meets with leaders of different countries, sometimes bad countries, sometimes countries that, we have a rocky relationship with, and there's the American flag, and there's the flag of the other country, and you just do it for sort of the photo op, right? This was absolutely not an endorsement of Nazi ideology by any means, and the way I know that is because we have reports of what Heber J. Grant spoke about at those meetings. Heber J. Grant went through the Articles of Faith, and he talked about them, and he expounded on them for both his Latter-day Saint and non-Latter-day Saint audience. That comes from multiple reports explaining what Heber J. Grant talked about. This was not a Nazi rally. This was not Heber J. Grant saying, I want everybody to become Nazis. And those men on the stand with him were not Nazis. Those were local church leaders and some church leaders that were traveling with him throughout his tour of Europe, visiting the saints, okay? So thank you for bringing that up. I wanted to make sure we address that because it's deeply dishonest to throw that picture up on the internet for shock value without any kind of context of what's happening. Heber J. Grant is under suspicion when he visits Germany. We know that because the Gestapo assigns an agent to spy on him. Her name is Fräulein Peike, and she writes a report detailing what Heber J. Grant spoke about in Berlin, and she is not impressed with Heber J. Grant. She is not impressed with his teaching, and she says Mormon teachings are incompatible with Nazi ideals, okay? So that hopefully explains a little bit that picture. Again, I have it too that we can show in just a minute as we go through the slides, but hopefully that should clear things up.
Yeah, that was great. That was great. I think that really settles it, and we can talk about it a little further. But I'll let you continue going on your presentation. Okay. So thanks for clearing that up.
Of course. So let me throw this back open then now. So let's look at some more sort of specific examples of what we learned from these new documents, right? So I mentioned that we have a lot of surveillance of church members and in their meetings. So the Nazis are closely monitoring both members and missionaries. They are providing reports of what they are encountering in church meetings. And it's throughout Germany. It's not just an isolated incident once or twice. It's systematic and it's coordinated. And they are specifically monitoring church meetings in order to determine if anything subversive is happening, right? They want to know, are the Mormons up to any sort of thing that would undermine the Nazi state, among other things, right? So we get that very clearly here. I mentioned the banning of church literature. So this is the Articles of Faith by James Talmage, the German translation, Die Glaubensartikel by James Talmage. It's a popular publication. It's one of my favorite books, actually. I love the Articles of Faith. In 1936, it is placed on a list of harmful and undesirable literature by the Reich Ministry for Culture. That is a part of Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister. That is part of his propaganda ministry. So, in other words, James E. Talmage's Articles of Faith was banned by some of the highest people in the Reich government. We don't know exactly why it was banned, but a very likely reason is because Elder Talmage discusses things like the gathering of Israel and the establishment of Zion in the last days, because we have an Article of Faith about that, right? You can imagine why that would attract the ire of the Nazis. And now we have the memorandum from July 1936 indicating that we are banning the Articles of Faith from publication and circulation in Germany, okay? So that is important context for this incident of the banning of Elder Talmage's book. How about the arrest of church members? We now have police reports of church members and missionaries being arrested for various reasons. I want to read this one from 1936. This is from a church member named Paul Herbert Sheik, who is arrested in 1936 at work because he refused to give the Hitler salute. We all know what it is. I won't do it for the camera. We all know the Hitler salute, right? And for singing the national anthem at his factory in Freiburg, Germany. So here's what the police report says. I want to read it. At a communal reception of the Führer's speech on March 27, 1836, the toolmaker Paul Herbert Sheik, born May 8, 1906, in Freiburg, residing in Freiburg, Domgasse No. 2, did not raise his hand for the German salute at the conclusion of the broadcast and did not sing the national anthem or the Horst Wessel song. The Horst Wessel Lied is a Nazi anthem that went with the national anthem, basically. The accused Sheik stated to the interrogating officer the following. So this is his account of why he didn't do it. So he says, I was at this reception for the Führer's speech, yada yada. I did not raise my right hand or sing the national anthem. My reason for it is thus. I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. As such, I support the establishment of the Kingdom of Zion. It contradicts my personal beliefs to serve both Zion and another Reich. The Mormons intend to establish and build a Zion that is free from national ties. It is meant to be a kingdom under the rule of Jesus Christ, to be established on the American continent. Nevertheless, I feel that as a German, I am subject to the Führer, but consider Zion to be the highest ideal. I only find a contradiction between the goals of Zion and the national anthem and the German salute, and therefore to my inner convictions. I have no further explanation to give regarding my behavior. I want us to remember Paul Herbert Sheik as a hero. Everybody knows Helmut Hubner. They've heard of his story and others, right, who resisted the Nazis. Paul Herbert Sheik's name appears nowhere in the published literature of church history on this part of church history, except for now that we have this report. So he deserves to be memorialized as an example of a Latter-day Saint who stood up to the Nazis because of his convictions as a Latter-day Saint. So that's one example of some of these new documents we get. This is also hugely important. Threats against church leaders are being made, and we have the threats. We have copies of the memoranda and the threats being made against church leaders from the Gestapo. So in the spring of 1936, Roy Welker, who's the mission president, he meets with Gestapo officials, with police officials, and they have a conversation, and they tell him, and this is in the police reports, they say, in the event of any perceived anti-state tendencies, the report says it was communicated to the leaders of the Mormons that they could expect the harshest and strictest state police measures against them. Okay? That is hugely important context to explain why the church adopted the accommodationist policy that it did. It adopted it because they were being directly told that if you or your members step out of line or do anything that is perceived to be against the state, you can expect reprisals by the police and by the Gestapo, okay? So, hugely significant context to explain why the church adopted this policy that it did with the Nazi regime. And we did not know that until these documents came to light explaining that. Yeah, here's this one memorandum from May 5th. Due to the increased advertising activities within the aforementioned sect by foreign, particularly American missionaries, a meeting of the senior representatives of the Mormons was held at the Secret State Police Office on April 3, 1936. During this meeting, it was conveyed to the representatives that in the event of anti-state propaganda activities, the strictest state police measures would be carried out against the sect. Okay? And then further at the end, it says, the sect is to be kept under further observation. In the event of further anti-state activities, I request a report. That is what the Nazis are doing. That's why they're spying on us. Okay. We already mentioned Heber J. Grant. We went over this, right? He speaks in both Frankfurt and in Berlin. He has an agent named Fräulein Peike who is spying on him, and she writes a report spying on him, right? And in her report, she says, the views of the Mormons and the articles of their creed do not fit our time or our National Socialist Germany. She says that, in her opinion, the teachings of the church might pose a danger to the common person. I believe it is possible that Judaism and perhaps Freemasonry could use this sect as instruments for their plans. Okay? So the Nazis are not positively impressed with what Heber J. Grant is saying. That puts to the lie this claim that Heber J. Grant was some kind of outspoken Nazi at some kind of rally telling people to join the Nazi party, right? Hugely significant there. And there's that picture again for those who can't see it. And again, the people with him up on the stand are not local Nazi party leaders. They are church leaders and his translator, Max Zimmer, and others who have traveled with him as he was speaking. So what about the Nazi attitude towards the Latter-day Saints? We now know what the Nazis thought about the Latter-day Saints. And what we know is that they were deeply suspicious of the church due to its teachings, its American origins, and its financial ties to the United States. We have multiple reports highlighting concerns that they have about foreign influence and sort of Nazi attitudes towards the church. And they are concerned that we would be promoting ideas or alliances beyond the control of the state. So what specifically are the Nazis suspicious of, and why don't they like the Latter-day Saints? They don't like the fact that Latter-day Saints are friendly towards Jews. Latter-day Saint philo-Semitism, both in our doctrine and in our practice, is concerning to them. Tithing and financial ties to the United States. They don't like the fact that money, as they believe, as they suppose, that money is leaving Germany to go back to the United States. As I understand it, actually, the money is staying in Germany and being used in Germany. It never actually leaves the United States, unlike today, where all money goes, directly to church headquarters in Salt Lake. My understanding, from what I understand from my research at the time, is it was staying in Germany, but they thought it was leaving Germany. Foreign origins, they don't like that we're an American church. They don't like that we have American missionaries. They see our doctrines as bizarre and deviant, and there's even some reports that are suspicious that the Mormons must secretly be practicing polygamy still, of course, right? Kind of that tired old anti-Mormon trope of secret polygamy. So these are just some of the reasons we get for why the Nazis are not a fan of the Latter-day Saints. Maybe we can now discuss this memorandum from 1938 to Alfred Rosenberg. And I'm going to read from it. It's a lengthy memorandum. I have the picture there. I won't go through the entire thing, but it's several pages long, and it's sort of a summary of the church and the church's beliefs and things like that. I want to go to the assessment made at the end of this memorandum, and I will read from it here. It says, number one, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is an international Judeo-Christian sect. That's not a good thing to be in the eyes of the Nazis. You don't want to be a Judeo-Christian sect by any means. It says, the doctrine of the Mormons is composed of elements from other religious groups, such as Buddhism, Islam, and Judaism. It represents a glorification of Judaism, the report says. The pro-Jewish stance is inevitably rooted in the doctrine, which is largely based on the Old Testament. Characteristic of this attitude is also the fact that the governors of Utah were often Jews. There was one Jewish governor of Utah, by the way. American missionaries in Germany today often reside with Jews, etc., etc. So they are very concerned about that fact. Here's number three. The sect is internationally oriented and advocates pacifist tendencies, as shown by a large part of their tracts and a frequently performed play in Germany called Freedom or Slavery. So they don't like the fact that the church is an international and pacifist-oriented organization, okay? Number four, they talk about the propaganda activities of the Mormons has been observed in Germany, right? So they're suspicious about that. And now here's a kicker, okay? Number five, it says this. The German leaders of the Mormons constantly claims that the sect recognizes the National Socialist state and also advocates for it abroad. He states that the doctrine of the Mormons and National Socialism are two worldviews that are very similar. So you hear that, and at first glance you think, oh, that's bad, because that means that must clearly mean that the church is aligned with Nazi ideology and that they were buddies with the Nazis or whatever, because the mission president apparently is going around saying, oh yeah, no, we're totally aligned with you guys, incompatible. Here's the next sentence from the report. Quote, this is a deliberate distortion of the facts. As is already evident from the previous points, the doctrine of the Mormons is incompatible with the National Socialist worldview. Furthermore, it is a fact that the Mormons in Germany show no interest in political events and current affairs. It is generally known that members of the sect categorically refuse to use the German salute. It is further proven that the American sect leadership still shamelessly agitates against National Socialist Germany today. Thus, there can be no talk of a pro-German attitude. So if you want proof that the church was not all buddy-buddy with the Nazis and that Mormon teachings or Mormon theology is compatible with Nazism, look no further than what the Nazis themselves are saying. The doctrine of the Mormons is incompatible with the National Socialist worldview, and there can be no talk of a pro-German attitude among church leaders in America, despite what some local leaders might be saying, obviously in an attempt to forward this sort of accommodationist policy. Hugely significant, this 1938 memorandum. One more thing, and then I'll turn back over to you, Daniel. We do have several documents where Nazi leaders are discussing whether to ban the church in Germany. Here are just three. A potential dissolution of the church was being considered. In 1937, a general ban on the proselyte activities of foreign missionaries of the Mormon church, a Mormon sect, is being considered. And another says that such a prohibition seems appropriate in the interest of establishing a populace thoroughly aligned with the National Socialist worldview. The question I have is, why would the Nazis have to ban the church or be discussing banning the church if it's the alleged fact, that the church is compatible with Nazism and that church leaders were super friendly with the Nazi leaders, right? And they got along and everything was great. No, the documentation clearly shows otherwise. So to conclude, we see a consistent pattern of surveillance and suspicion and attempts to control the activities of the church in Nazi Germany. The church was subjected to scrutiny by the Gestapo and others. Latter-day Saint beliefs were dismissed as bizarre and incompatible with Nazism. And discussions were being had about the church's future in Germany and the upper echelons of the Reich government. There was no general prohibition of the church. They ultimately did not implement such. The two main reasons being basically that the accommodationist policy seemed to work. It seemed to sort of appease the Nazis and mollify them enough that they did not actually target the church as like an official target of theirs. Also, the documents talk about the fact that there are so few Latter-day Saints in Germany, relatively speaking, that it's just not kind of worth their time or worth their effort. So one of the reports says, from a state political perspective, the sect appears to be relatively harmless due to its small number of members in Germany, right? So what I mean this means is when you find books like this, David Connolly Nelson, Moroni and the Swastika, he takes a very negative, very cynical interpretation of the actions of church leaders at this time. I think that my documents I've published now fundamentally challenge Nelson's thesis. Church leaders, we now know, were facing direct threats of reprisals and potential prohibition if they were perceived as to be acting against the regime. And clearly the Nazis did not think that church teachings were compatible with Nazism. So I think that we need to have a more nuanced and charitable interpretation of events than what guys like David Connolly Nelson will say. Fundamentally, the church's accommodationist policy, I believe, must be understood as a survival tactic under totalitarian rule. Latter-day Saint teachings do not align with National Socialism, and the Nazis themselves recognized as much. So that's all I really kind of have. Let me come back to here, sort of as my sweeping overview. Again, I invite listeners to go to mormon.org, or if you are a subscriber to Latter-day Saint Historical Studies, you might get a copy of this in the mail. But I will turn the time back to you, Daniel, for any other further questions or discussion we may want to have.
Yeah, so this has been great. I'm really enjoying this this discussion. Another one of the questions that I did have, and I think we kind of covered it a little bit, but for those listening that might have been a little bit lost in the sauce a little bit, one of the questions I had is, if I remember correctly, and just correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember correctly, was it Nazi officials or people that were specifically spying on Latter-day Saints, was there a letter or was there something that, if I remember correctly, basically they were saying that after the Jews, okay, or after basically we, kill and exterminate the Jews, that we're going for the Mormons. Am I remembering that detail correctly? Is that related to this? Or am I mistaken?
So what you're referring to is an account that comes from Otto Berndt. Otto Berndt was a Latter-day Saint in Germany who was the district president to Helmut Hübner in Hamburg, Germany. So without going into too much into the story, Helmut Hübner was a Latter-day Saint who, together with some of his friends, distributed anti-Nazi leaflets, anti-Nazi publications, and he was arrested, and his friends were arrested and put on trial. Hübner was executed, and his friends were given prison sentences. And in the midst of all of that, Otto Berndt, the district president, was summoned by the Gestapo to interrogate him under suspicion that perhaps Hübner had help from other church leaders, right? So in his memoir, in his recollection of his interrogation, which lasted several days, about like 3 or 4 days or something, he's interrogated, and in that interrogation is where Otto Berndt heard it said to him by one of his interrogators with the Gestapo, well, once we have won the war and once we've solved the Jewish question, you Mormons are next. Now, take that for what it's worth. It's not like it was an official directive from the government. It was this one interrogator. It's very possible that he was trying to psych out Otto Berndt, right? Trying to kind of get into his head or make him nervous. It's also possible that that's what they were kind of planning, right? That give them enough time, they were going to rid Germany of not just the Jews, but any kind of undesirable elements or any people or groups that they thought were not compatible with Nazi beliefs. So it's not like it was like an official decree or anything, but it does come from a real account from a first-hand source who describes his experience sort of being threatened with that. But we don't know if it would have, obviously, thank goodness Germany lost the war, right? So it never came to that. But, who's to say? It's a counterfactual. Who's to say if it would have been implemented? It's certainly possible. We just don't know. We don't know. But that's what you're probably thinking about, I think, is the account from Otto Berndt.
Awesome. That's great. And I think that's very, very helpful, very insightful, that, take it for what it's worth and just kind of make your, best judgment on that. Don't just dismiss it, but don't accept it as necessarily like an objective fact, but or a specific leader from Germany. So that's helpful. The other question I have comes from actually one of our listeners, and one of the things that he asked he says, were Nazis actually interested in occultism and therefore interested in Latter-day Saints as a modern religion with esoteric rites and practices in its tradition?
Okay, so the first part of that answer is not really. So were Nazis into the occult? So Heinrich Himmler and some others, they kind of were into that stuff, like the early like proto-pagan Germanic stuff or whatever, right? Like runes and that kind of stuff, right? Castle, what's the name of it? Wavelsburg. I'm butchering the name, but there was like a little retreat. I think it was Wavelsburg was the name of it. I have to double check, but it was this little retreat that the SS set up. It was like a little castle that Heinrich Himmler would do these kind of like quasi-pagan rituals or whatever for the SS, right? But Hollywood and the Wolfenstein video games have kind of blown that out of proportion, right? Hitler reportedly thought it was all a bunch of nonsense, right? Himmler's obsession with the occult and things like that. So it's not like the Nazis as an ideology was obsessed with the occult. There were certain Nazis that tried to tie back Nazi ideology with, again, like sort of Germanic paganism and things like that. As to the second part of the question, the answer appears to be no. It doesn't really seem that the Nazis were interested in Latter-day Saints because, well, we like the occult and the Mormons like the occult with their esoteric temple rituals or whatever. That does not seem to be the reason why we attracted their attention. The reason we attracted their attention is because we were a religious minority from the United States who were a little too friendly with the Jews and were bringing in American missionaries to do propaganda activities in Germany, and that our doctrines were weird and bizarre and deviant from what was sort of acceptable for Nazi ideology. Really, the occult stuff doesn't really come up all that much. You do get comments dismissing Mormon theology as like weird and bizarre, but there's no like obsession with the Mormons because we are cultists like the Nazis allegedly are.
That's very helpful. The other question I have in regard to this whole discussion is you mentioned that a lot of these files, documents weren't available until basically your work with B.H. Roberts Foundation. Was there a specific reason for that? Was they just like not released to the public? Were they just not available? What was the reason why they weren't available until recently?
I think for the most part, it may have just been inaccessibility of the archives. You don't just
Okay.
waltz up to an archival database, right, or housing facility and say, let me look at all your documents. Like,
Sure.
there's a whole process of, you have to be there for a reason, know what you're looking for. Is access being granted in the first place, or is it restricted? Yada, yada, yada. So I imagine for years and years, just a matter of, and there's lots of documents on World War II, obviously, in Nazi Germany, right? Tons of them. So
Yeah.
I imagine for many years, it was just researchers just didn't really know about them because they weren't readily accessible. The first person that I've been able to track down in the academic literature on this who just cites their existence was a German historian who wrote a book on this that came out in like 2012 or 2013. And he just mentions in a footnote that this dossier exists. He doesn't actually cite any of the documents from the dossier. He just says, oh, yeah, and, this dossier exists. Reading his book and reading that footnote is where I'm like, hey, wait a second, there's this dossier, but like no one's ever cited it. So that's what led me to kind of try to track it down and obtain a file of it. So really, I don't think it was anything kind of nefarious or anything. It was just probably, decades of neglect. Researchers weren't able to get it in time. However, so I will cut them a little slack. However, I will not cut slack to people like David Conley Nelson, whose book came out after this other book I mentioned references these documents. David Conley Nelson, by all rights, should have been aware of this material, and he should have been citing it and discussing it in his book. If he's going to make such strong and negative conclusions about the church, then he absolutely should have accounted for this evidence and incorporated it into his reconstruction, into his narrative, and he doesn't do that. And so I will critique him and other scholars more recently who take a more negative slant on this if they don't account for this evidence, which they haven't. But for most other scholars, again, it's just kind of the reality of scholarship. Archival work is always evolving and ongoing. I don't expect anybody to be omniscient to know. I'm certainly not, right? I don't know everything all the time. But there are certain scholars who should have known better. And David Conley Nelson is one of them, if he was actually doing his due diligence, which I don't believe he did. So the reason I came across it is I happen to be employed for Josh Coates. So I had the means and the time and the ability to hunt this stuff down. And hopefully now that the documents are accessible, more scholars can now incorporate them into their work on this period of church history.
Awesome. That's great. That great, nice and simple to the point. I think that was very, very helpful. Just understanding a little bit more for people that aren't as aware of scholarship, whether it be our listeners that are critical or more or believers. So I think that's very helpful. Just understanding how things are obtained and why this is more of a recent discovery in academia versus beforehand. But just to close out, I want to quickly just ask you one last question, because we talked about a lot of different things today, a lot of different topics, all surrounding one topics, and so perhaps there may be one of our listeners that may be a little bit confused and made it to this point, and they're like, okay, I'm still a little bit confused. So if there's just one thing that I think you want to really just hone in on and focus on, that you want people to know based on this discussion today, what would that be? What would be the biggest takeaway or the biggest thing that one of our viewers that you would really want them to really just to with one of our viewers just to go ahead.
Yeah. So fundamentally, these documents demonstrate that the church's accommodationist approach towards the Nazi regime, the church's policy of coexistence with the Nazis and sort of playing nice, quote unquote, as it were, with the Nazis. Fundamentally, that was a survival strategy. It was not because of ideological alignment. It was not because church teachings are compatible with Nazism. It is not because church leaders were super down with the Nazis and what they were doing. It is because, and these documents show it, church members and church leaders were being directly threatened by the Nazis in Germany, that if you step out of line, you can expect harsh reprisals from us. So these documents fundamentally contextualize and explain the church's policy decision in dealing with the Nazi government at this time, right? It corrects the misunderstanding and the bad faith, cynical interpretation people have that church leaders were just, at best, they were a bunch of feckless cowards that were too scared to stand up to the evil Nazis, and at worst they were complicit and aligned and friendly to and allies with the Nazis. No, I would fundamentally call into question that assumption and that interpretation of the evidence. So that's the first thing I would want to say. The second thing I would want to say, we now have direct, unfiltered access into what the Nazis thought of the Latter-day Saints, and it is not positive. You never get any really glowing or positive encouragement or recommendations from the Nazis on the Mormons in Germany, right? Rarely you will find things like, well, they're not doing anything bad right now, so we're just going to, you might get occasionally, well, we had a positive experience talking to this guy or whatever, right? But like by and large, it is negative. The assessments are negative. The feelings are negative. It is feelings of suspicion. It is feelings of, as I read, incompatibility and attempts to monitor the church under the sort of idea that eventually we're going to ban these guys, right? So that's the thing I would want to say. The final thing that comes out of this, we now have stories of brave Latter-day Saints who stood up to the regime that we did not have previously. I want people to remember Paul Herbert Sheik. I want his story to be remembered. He deserves to be remembered, and his heroism deserves to be remembered. And so I'm grateful that we now have some of these more stories and these accounts that help flesh out the experience of Latter-day Saints in Nazi Germany. So to summarize, number one, I think these documents fundamentally call into question the negative, cynical interpretation. Number two, they show us what the Nazis thought of Latter-day Saints, and it's not positive. And number three, it shows us these stories of different Latter-day Saints that deserve to be remembered, because otherwise we wouldn't have them, and I'm grateful that we do.
That was a great closing, and I can add on to that also. First off, but Stephen, thank you so much for being on today and just discussing your research. Everyone will be sure to link what he talked about in the description below, as well as this little presentation that you'll be able to see. So thank you so much for everyone for tuning in to another episode of Sword and Spirit, and we'll see you all next week. Take care, everyone.